All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about how to do the basics of a drag and drop system. So I showed you in the beginning there the drag and drop system we're going to be making there, and I can show you a little more, things that we can add on a little later to start making it a little more complex. But for now, we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a brand new scene here. So I'm going to go with a user interface. I can leave the default as a control, that's fine. And I'm just going to add 2 color rects just so I can differentiate between my two. Whoops, this is all backwards. There we go. So I can differentiate between the 2 sets that I'm using. Just a little easier. Duplicate that one, bring that one down. So I'm going to make one of these a green, a transparent green, and I'll make the other one, let's go with a transparent blue. Alright, so we have these 2 light windows here. We can easily see them, no problems going on. Pretty simple so far. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in some textures here. I think we're going to use I believe I used a grid container initially. But it doesn't really matter which one you use. So if you want to use a grid container just for something that you can keep adding to, say for like a skill window, so you can keep everything perfectly separate and everything, you can do that. And I think because of that, I'm going to go ahead and use a grid container here. I'm just going to set this to be the full size of my color rect. And I'll go ahead and add in a texture rect, because if this was to be something like a skill, something that you're going to drag, it doesn't need to be activated. It needs to just be an image that shows you your skill, right? So I'm going to go ahead and for my first one, I'll just bring the Godot icon in there just so we can get a good look. And I'll duplicate that a couple times, set my grid container columns to be 4 across, and I can see my color rect isn't exactly big enough for this. So just increase the size of that. There we go. Alright, so now that fills all 4 of my sides. Now to show this a little easier, I'm going to go ahead and just change at least one of these textures to a gradient texture 2D. Open that up, go to my gradient, select my 2 sides, and I'll make this one a little more on the golden side. Alright, here we go. Something a little more like that. There, something like that, and then I'll go to my second color and I'll add in maybe something like this and pull it down a bit just so it's not so intense. There we go. And set my size to be the same as with the Godot icon, 128 by 128, which is the default. And this way we can see that we actually have 2 different textures going on, so we can easily see the overlapping. Alright, now for color rect 2, just to show you that we can go with, these don't need to be identical. So for something like a hotbar, maybe we do a V-box that is a full rect. And inside of that, we'll do an H-box. And for this V-box, we'll set it to be center. And same with our H-box center. Alright, that way everything's perfectly lined out. And we can go ahead and we could add something in this. So in this case, I'm going to use a texture button. This way you can see that we don't need they don't have to be the exact same nose that we're dragging from and to. So for this texture button, I'm going to go ahead and just give it a texture. Again, I'll go 2D, gradient, and you know what? I think I'll just keep this on the darker gray of 2727. And that'll represent, I guess, our empty slot here. And we'll go ahead 128, 128, and 1, 2, 3, 4. So now we have 4 of those. Let me just make an adjustment here for our size. There we go. V box is full, H box is full, perfect. Right, so now we have our 2 containers, each with their own slots. The bottom one looks like a hotbar, where we have some empty slots that we can hopefully drag things to, and the top could be our skills, it could be equipment, and again, it doesn't have to be a hotbar slot, it could be an equipment slot, doesn't really matter, it's the same base principle. We're dragging something from one spot to another. In this case, we're using a text direct just for an image, and we're dragging it into a texture button that we could then make the button do something if we wanted to go a little more advanced. So how do these work? Well, at a base, I'm just going to go onto my text direct here and give it a, well, I'll go ahead and save this first. Side video step. I'll call this drag test scene, and I'll add a script to this, and this will be our, doesn't really matter what we call it, I'll say available items script. Doesn't really matter too much here, but each of these drag and drops are going to rely on a couple functions. I'm just going to go ahead and set this on all my text directs here, all 4 of them. There we go. All right, so this is going to rely on at its base a func get drag data, and we have to return something here, so I'll just hit return. This is going to have a can drop data. This needs, again, something passed into it. In this case, I'll just say true for now. And the other function we're going to work with here is drop data, just drop data. So we have get drop data, can drop data, and just drop data. These are the 3 functions that make a drag and drop system work. And you could add more to it to make it more complex, but at the core, these are the only 3 functions that we need to make drag and drop itself work. Now, for all of these, we're going to use, I can go ahead and copy these same functions onto our texture button. So texture button, I'm going to go ahead and add a new script to that, and I'm going to call this my hot slot script. Paste that onto there. And I'll add this script to all of my texture buttons. All right, so since we only want this dragging to work one way on our hot slot, we're not going to need the get drag data, because we only need that for the thing that we're going to drag. We're going to need the can drop. That way we can verify that we can drop this piece of data here. And drop data is what happens when we do drop it. So if you are following that, then up here on our texture recs, we need get drag data, because we need to know what information we're dragging. And we don't have to worry about can drop, because we're not going to drop anything onto these spots. And again, we don't need the drop data function, because we're not going to drop anything. So we don't need to check if we can drop, and we don't need to actually drop anything. All we're going to need from here is our drag data. So basically, we're going to come in, we'll take a look, and as we have our mouse over any of our textures here, we'll click, and as soon as we start dragging while we're holding down our left mouse, get drag data is going to trigger, and now our mouse is holding this particular piece of data. And we're going to come down here, and this is going to perform a check while we're hovering over this of the can drop function. And if we cannot drop, our mouse is going to change. And if we can drop, then when we let go, we're going to process whatever that data is. So for example here, I'll come in here, I'll say can drop on my slots to be false. And can drag data would say we'll go ahead and we'll return the texture of our texture rect, and texture is just the property here that holds the texture of that data. So if we bring that in, we take a look, we see our mouse change immediately because we cannot drop anything in this area. We come on down to our hot slots, we can't drop anything there because can drop automatically is returning false. We're not performing an actual check. But you can see that we can't drop anything there. And if can drop data were to return true to us, then you'll see as we drag it, we cannot drop it here, but once we enter that slot, we can now drop it in here. You see our mouse change to give us this indication. Now, if we let go and actually drop anything, nothing's going to happen because we're just passing. Yeah, we are just passing. We're not actually doing anything with that data. So the first thing we need to actually do is see if we can drop. So what we're going to return is a Boolean of either true or false. And to get that, we're going to say return. And we can see data is something that gets passed into us. Data. And that data is whatever we're returning here from our get drag data function. So return data, and we looked at that. It is the texture from our texture rect. So we can say return data is texture 2D. And now if that is if our data that's being passed in is a texture, then it's going to let us drop. As you see, we come in and it lets us drop. Perfect. And we can see when this happens as well. For example, we're going to say print, and we'll say checking drop. And if we were to run this, you see as soon as we drag, nothing, we get in here and we see we're checking the drop. And if you look on the right hand side of the debugger, you see it's sitting at 52 messages, and that's going to check every time my mouse moves. We're going to keep checking. Right? So as long as we sit still, it's going to stop. And as soon as our mouse changes positions or moves positions, we're going to perform some more checks. So we can see there exactly when it is checking. And likewise, if you really wanted to, you can go ahead and you could print in on our texture rect, getting drag data. If we were to run that, you can see exactly when it's going to get that data. As soon as we left click and drag a little bit, we've got that drag data, and you see we only make that check the one time. So we have that data on our mouse. We come down here, we can see we're allowed to drop it. We let go, nothing happens. So let's make something happen now. So to hopefully clear any confusion you may or may not have here, texture rect, the only function we're using here is the get drag data. And we need to return something. It doesn't matter what the data type is. That's why it's just a variant, because we can return anything. And what we are returning is the texture of our texture rect. And on our hot slot that we want to use, we're using the function can drop data. And we're returning basically an if check. Data is texture 2D. So if the data that's being passed in is a texture 2D, then we'll get a return of true. And if it returns true, then we're allowed to drop our data in there. And with that, that allows us to move on to the next function, drop data. So instead of passing here, what we're going to do is we're going to get the texture underscore normal of our texture button in this case. And we can set that equal to the data that we're dropping. Because remember, our data is a texture 2D. So since it's a texture, we can assign it to our texture underscore normal. And we don't have to worry about doing any preventative if checks here. Because if it's not a texture 2D, then our code is not going to let us drop it. So if we just run that, we can take a look. We can now drag it in and drop. And we can do this with any of these into any of our slots. And of course, we can also overwrite these slots. Right? So at its core, that's a drag and drop system. It's that simple for a basic drag and drop. And now what I would like to show you from here is how to do something a little more advanced, or to up this for something, say, let's say it was a skill that we wanted to use. Right? So I'm going to go back to my example scene here that we had in the very beginning. And I just have the same setup here. Color rect, grid container, our textures, the same script, another color rect, my VBox and HBox, as well as my texture buttons in there, and the same scripts. Now the difference is here, I've gone ahead and I've created a resource for myself. And of course, you don't have to do this in order for this to work, but right here. So I just went ahead and created myself a class. It's called skill resource. It has a static function because it needs to be. And it's called activate. And I can override this function. And that is exactly what I'm going to be doing. So I have a printing skill, which extends my skill resource. And I'm overriding my activate. And the printing skill is just going to print out printing, ha 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 ha. And then I've given myself an ice skill, which is going to print out become the very ice you seek to destroy. And I have a fire skill that says burn the world down. Okay. So these are essentially my skills that I'm going to activate. So if these were skills, I can now click on them in my hotbar or activate them with a button press, whatever it is. And this piece of code, this block of code, is what I would want to happen as a result. So if I look at my available skill, which is my texture rect code here, I've gone ahead and I've created a dictionary of skill data that I'm going to pass in. And in my case, I just have my skill names. Now you can make these skills individual, or you can assign them when you unlock them in the skill tree and add them into your available skills window or whatever. That's fine, but just for this example, I've went ahead and just added my skills here: printing, fire, and ice, and I'm selecting a random one. So when I run this, all 4 of these skills at the top have one of these random skills assigned to it. Now, it doesn't do anything yet, but you see, when I get my drag data, I'm going to access my dictionary. I'm going to set the texture of it, right? That way I can have that drag and drop functionality. My skill data, I'm adding the skill name, so whatever is randomly selected here, whether it's the fire skill, ice skill, or printing skill. And then I'm going to go ahead and set a drag preview. Now this preview, if you want to add this is completely optional. This is how you would do it. It needs to be some type of control node, so it has to be a UI node of some sort. Now for me, I'm using a texture rect for this. So I'm creating a texture rect new. I'm setting the tr.texture. So the texture property of my texture rect is equal to the texture of what it is I'm dragging. That way we can actually look like we're dragging the item. It wouldn't make sense otherwise. And then for me, I'm going to change the modulate of it. I'm going to leave it as the default white that you see, but I'm going to change the alpha of it to 0.5 so that it is partially transparent. And that's what this is as I'm dragging it around, that blueprint, right? And that's all you would need. That's all you would need, as well as the function set drag preview. And if we were to take a look at the test scene that we just did here, and if I wanted to, I can come in here, right? We can paste just those lines there where we create a texture rect, give it a texture, make it a little transparent, and call set drag preview. And we would get that in our example scene here. So if you really want that preview, those are the 4 lines you would need to add. Now back to this, and then I'm just going to return, instead of returning a texture like we did in our demo scene, I'm returning my whole dictionary. That means on my texture button, I don't need this anymore. That was some testing that I had in here, so we can ignore this. Yes. So I just have a skill variable in here added to my texture button. I have the pressed signal automatically connected to it. And when I click on my button, I'm basically going to say if there's a skill in that slot, then we'll activate it. Now here's our can drop. Again, I'm using a dictionary, remember, instead of a texture. So I'm checking if my data is a dictionary, which it is. Then we move into from our can drop, because we have it returning true. We go to our drop data. And for me, I'm setting my text normal just like we did before, only mine's inside of a dictionary. So I'm getting data, texture. And then for my skill, I'm just loading in whatever that skill is. right? So I'm assigning skill to the script in this location. So for me, it's inside of my res. For you, you might have a dedicated skills folder or directory. Whatever skill that was selected, .gd, right? And then that's, of course, where our underscore activate function here is going to be called from, whatever skill that is. So if I go ahead and run this, drag it in, that first one, we click, it is our printing skill. Our colorful one here, it's the ice skill. Our third one is also an ice skill, and our fourth one is a fire skill. So there's an idea of how you could go about something like that for skills. All right, so hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can do basic drag and drop, maybe for equipment, and hopefully gives you an idea of how you can do it if you want to do something like skills. All right, that's it. This is running on a little long, but that's all. Take care. Have yourselves a good one, and I'll see you guys next week.